Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, and best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to learn how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello everyone, I'm Brad Hairston with Blue Prism. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. I'm really excited to have as my guest today James Duez, the CEO and co-founder of Rainbird Technologies, a UK-based AI company and partner of Blue Prism. Today's topic is tackling fraud with AI-enabled digital workers. James, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Brad. It's good to be here.
You bet. So why don't you introduce yourself and your company?
Yes, so nice to meet everybody. I'm James. I'm the chief executive and co-founder of Rainbird. We're an 8-year-old company working in the intelligent automation space. Our technology is focused on automating the sort of complex decision-making that's usually reserved for humans. So as you've said, we're partnered with Blue Prism and our technologies are integrated together, and often Rainbird is seen as the smart decisioning layer that may sit over some robotic process automation. So typically that might be making the kind of complex judgments that are necessary within a whole range of different fields, whether that be healthcare or financial services or insurance, anywhere where you have people making complex decisions. And of course, there's huge application for these technologies within the fraud space.
James, as you know, fraud levels increase in times of economic distress. And without a doubt, the global pandemic has been no exception. This challenge is affecting almost every industry, and it's also affecting most of us at a personal level. When was the last time you received a fraudulent robocall or had a credit card transaction suspended or saw an unexpected charge on your credit card bill? 5 minutes ago, perhaps? Here's a couple of data points just to drive this home. From the BBC in the UK, they're reporting that there have been more than 6,000 cases of COVID-related fraud and cybercrime during the pandemic. And that number is obviously going to continue to go up. Also, the Action Fraud team in the UK reported that over £34.5 million have been stolen since March 1st of last year. And in the US, it's no better. Fox Business reports from an expert on unemployment fraud that has seen more than $200 billion in federal assistance for unemployed Americans be pocketed through fraud. And it's important to know that this finding is more than triple the official government estimate of $63 billion, which is what they predicted. So this is definitely a very, very serious issue, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So let's start here. What types of fraudulent behavior specifically have seen an increase over the past year? Could you speak to that, James?
Yeah, so credit card fraud has risen dramatically during lockdown. Identity theft is on the rise. I mean, it's pretty much on the rise almost everywhere. Corporate and invoice fraud has absolutely skyrocketed. And I think remote working has caused a fragility that has been increasingly exploited as well. Insurance and retail have seen huge rises. In the UK here, CBILS, furlough and universal credit applications, as you've hinted, are good examples of where there have been massive levels of fraud. And in fact, universal credit's seen something like 30% of cases had some kind of fraud on them. Big proportion of money lost in investment fraud. That's actually one of the highest proportion of authorized fraud losses in 2020, with over 135 million lost. And impersonation fraud has increased dramatically. So this is where criminals pretend to be banks or Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs or some other organization. That's up 94% on the year before. And bank transfer fraud, I would say as well, over £500 million stolen in bank transfer fraud in 2020, according to UK Finance. That figure's actually only up about 5% on the previous year. But I think one of the things that many have to bear in mind is that whilst organizations are trying to make sure that consumers don't lose out because of fraud, in the case of bank transfer fraud, less than half the people who've been victims of that fraud have actually seen their money back. It's really on the increase across the board.
James, what does the fraud investigation process look like in most companies today?
So, there's some degree of automation, but much of the process today remains very manual. These processes suffer from disparate systems, data sources, and the various systems that are required to investigate fraud are not always connected. And that's a critical issue, particularly in the larger organizations that have accumulated more technical legacy over the years, because quite often it's not acceptable to just have an automated fraud message go out to a customer. You quite rightly mentioned how frequently we're all badgered by these messages, but it would be even worse if they didn't have humans in the loop trying to intervene. And this is really because quite often banks are using statistical machine learned algorithms for attempting to identify suspicious transactions, but that always comes with a very high level of false positives. It's really sky high, in excess of 95%. So once you've got a queue of kind of human work that needs to be done, those human workers then have to pour through those transactions, and quite often institutions would rather suffer the cost of the fraud than unnecessarily annoy their customers. And this is particularly prevalent actually in the US, where you guys have more credit cards than we tend to here, and it just tends to go to the back of the wallet if that account becomes a problem and you use another card. So this is an area that we work in, really enabling banks to automate the complex human reasoning in such a way that of course outperforms those humans in speed, because ultimately that's the efficiency play. This is technology, but also in terms of the quality of those decisions. So you can imagine a world where you have Blue Prism getting hold of data and solving some of that disparate systems challenges, but you're then combining that with statistical systems like Falcon and others making predictions, but applying some automated decisioning on top of that to take really what's a prediction and turn that into something that can be a judgment. And that's calling out to customers is still very entrenched in the approach. It's important that these transactions are validated with customers. And there are some technical advances that have been moving forward, but it's still a very labor-intensive process with lots of opportunities for improving not just the efficiency, but the quality of work that's being done.
James, how has this affected both employees and customers?
Well, banks are trying to prevent fraud, of course, but they're also trying to save the customer experience so that card doesn't go to the back of the wallet. Internally, the size of teams continue to grow, especially in banking. The role of the human caseworker remains absolutely critical. And it's really getting out of balance when you've got banks needing to reduce costs and having to run a higher number of transactions. And that's where we come in, of course. But this is also compounded by banks attempting to hold harmless consumers, even if the consumer was at fault. And I mentioned earlier, over 50% of bank transfer frauds, people are not getting their money back. So the impact is, in short, the very high false positive rate, because these algorithms are often statistical and not explainable. They can say this looks wrong, but they can't tell you why. You need a human to look at that. Bigger teams internally, but also this big challenge of the customer experience. And even after false positives, customers, in some circumstances, as many as 40% of customers churn because they're being badgered by incorrectly identified fraud. It's not fraud, it's something saying it's fraud, and that just becomes too much. And that's the tricky balance that's impacting both the employees that work for these organizations and the customers.
I'm sure we've all had that experience where we've taken a client to dinner and we have a rather expensive bill to pay for. So you put your credit card down, they take it to the back, and the waiter comes back and says your card has been declined. And you realize it's because it flipped some trigger, some threshold that caused it to be declined. That can certainly be a little embarrassing and annoying. So it's definitely something companies will want to avoid. James, how does current technology come up short in the battle against fraud today?
Yeah, so that false positive rate and the technologies of choice to tackle that has been an issue. Fraud is dramatically on the increase. We have to remember that the incidence of fraud compared with the volume of transactions is, of course, very small. And there's always going to be a low pickup rate. You mentioned the restaurant example. Pretty much every time I fly to New York, I can guarantee that my credit card won't work the first time I get there, and I try and use it. A smart person could look at my data and see my assistant bought bought flights to New York. I'm legitimately there. And anybody who happened to see that red flag can go manually check that and then choose not to bother me and take that risk. But this requires technology and humans to work together in a way that's not traditionally been very easy. Teams struggle with the fact that they've got siloed data sources and systems that are not talking to each other. Clearly, that's the domain of Blue Prism. But they're also still over-reliant on human expertise, that seasoned fraud investigator that's been there for 10 or 20 years and scaling what they know. And when you've got large numbers of people making decisions in a domain like this, where there are so many variables, even where the rules are pretty well understood, you have this hidden cost of inconsistent decision making. You know, how many times did somebody miss a fraud case, or how many times did they push a case to be referred to somebody who's more experienced unnecessarily? The technology is there, but it requires you to build an end-to-end solution that comprises something like Blue Prism to do with the data access pieces, these statistical algorithms. We have a platform called Evelyn, which is very focused on building more explainable machine learned algorithms, but then taking what ultimately is some connectivity and challenges with some statistical predictions, but being able to reason over that, being able to look at that through the lens of a seasoned expert to be able to do that at scale. That's key. And I think the final point on this challenge here is that organizations struggle to respond to spikes in volume. And Black Friday, Christmas, the various different times when transaction volume goes through the roof, that's really a problem. And the post-pandemic world doesn't make that any easier when you're managing a distributed workforce. And of course, these technologies can also help bring quality and auditability to the work that's still in many parts of the world being done remotely.
As we all know, new fraudulent schemes are being created every single day. How does Rainbird deal with this constant change?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And actually, this constant change is one of the reasons why traditionally building anything that's rules-based is going to be very limited in its scope traditionally, right? Ultimately, what we're doing with Rainbird is we're coding the topic of fraud in general rather than any kind of linear process. So it's a bit like you're explaining the ingredients of fraud. It's like the ingredients of a cake. You're not trying to create a recipe for every type of fraud. You're trying to show what the ingredients are. And that means that Rainbird can be used to flag when new types of fraud appear, but they have some of the trademarks that may have been seen elsewhere. It's a very holistic, probabilistic way of being able to identify what's fraud and what isn't fraud. And I think secondly, the more that you can lean on technology to scale what you understand, you liberate some of your best, most experienced people to be able to focus on being proactive for looking for new fraud patterns as well. Of course, it's possible to spot new patterns through the technology, but if you can free up your seasoned experts so that rather than running around helping a bunch of junior staff deal with these cases, if you can make everybody as good as that expert on their best day, but 100 times faster and probably better, then you free up that expert to do what technology is very poor at sometimes, and that is looking at the real edge cases and looking at those new discoveries that have to be made.
That makes sense. So let's talk about the Blue Prism Rainbird partnership. How do Blue Prism and Rainbird complement each other and provide a more end-to-end intelligent automation solution to tackle fraud?
Blue Prism picks up cases that have been flagged as potentially fraud by monitoring and detection systems and pulls in potentially other useful important data. So that would be one example. You may then have Rainbird call or Blue Prism call on Rainbird to then reason over each of those cases using codified human expertise. Rainbird can then make a decision for which it will provide a level of certainty. How confident is Rainbird in this decision? That's typically a percentage score. But of course, that can be on many different axes. So it may be, I'm 100% sure that this particular aspect of the data is fraudulent, is probably much more meaningful than going, I'm 50% sure that there's something wrong in another area. So we're going to look at this with a kind of multi-dimensional, very sophisticated probabilistic model, and then provide a full explanation as to why that decision was reached by being able to describe the factors considered and their relevant weightings, and then return that back to Blue Prism, which may then drive the next action for each case based on on Rainbird's judgment. So that could be sending customer notifications or creating incident reports or something else. So that's a typical kind of pattern for how Blue Prism and Rainbird may complement each other to create something that's end-to-end. Is Blue Prism will do a lot of that orchestration, access disparate and challenging systems, perform those downstream triggers, and allow Rainbird to be the smart layer that does all of that intelligent reasoning.
James, how does this intelligent automation affect the compliance function?
Well, compliance people are preoccupied quite rightly with making sure that things are done correctly. And actually, we get involved, let's say, with a fraud project that has compliance implications, and the compliance team are able to not just understand how the system works in general terms, but they can look at every individual decision and get an audit trail to be able to see how that decision was reached. But I think one of the other things that happens is when we implement the first project, compliance teams realize the ways in which intelligent automation can more broadly transform the compliance function. And this is really the power of what I call platform over point solutions. It's very easy to go out there and buy a point solution that does one thing or a series of those and try and stitch those together. For some reason, that's why RPA is so important. But actually, if you can adopt platforms like Blue Prism and Rainbird that are already integrated, then you have a toolkit to be able to do other things. So, for instance, fraud investigation and know your client KYC onboarding checks both have the common denominator that in every case, some level of reasoning needs to be applied in order to reach a decision. So in fraud investigation, each of these decisions is essentially deciding, was this transaction fraudulent or not? And in KYC onboarding, each of these decisions is essentially deciding, does this potential customer present a sufficiently low level of risk that I'm allowed to onboard them and meet all of the regulatory compliance checks that are there? These are both complex decisions. Just to one extent, fraud is one aspect of onboarding, but to be able to, reason over these various different models, to join them together, to make highly nuanced decisions, to scale scarce human expertise, and to provide decision support to people that maybe don't have to ring the compliance team to check something because they have a digital solution supporting them in that. This is a very powerful set of technology, and compliance teams want decisions to be fair and accurate, meet the regulatory standards, and that means they have to be auditable and explainable. And what this means ultimately is that the attention of the compliance function can be much more targeted, again, to where human attention is really needed. So it delivers a level of efficiency, but it's also about getting superior results, adaptability, auditability in a platform that once you've built one thing, you've implemented one solution like fraud, you suddenly realize there are 10 other decision-intensive human processes within the organization that can give it the next leg up in terms of the scale of efficiency and the quality of those outcomes. And ultimately, the better the decisions, the fewer the false declines, the less customer churn there is. That it's better for businesses, but it's also better for customers.
It's really easy to see the connection between KYC and fraud investigations. So I'm glad you pointed that out. James, can you share a customer success story?
Yeah, sure. So let's cover an intelligent fraud detection case study. We worked with the fraud team of a major high street bank and demonstrated how we could take a review process that typically would take somewhere between 10 and 12 minutes down to just an average of 2 seconds. And this equated to a saving of about 15 full-time employees a day when processing just one very small team doing one particular task.
Wow.
Now, it's very easy to look at that and think that's an amazing efficiency play. And of course, that's important. But this is also was freeing this team up to be able to process a much higher volume of investigations, which they were just having to let go. So in a way, it was in this theme of not just being focused on cost reduction, but how do we take these very experienced people and enable them to do a much greater volume of work? And interestingly, it's why 2 seconds and not 2 milliseconds? Because occasionally the technology would ask the human a few questions. So, imagine you've got a model that's looking across this data and going, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but if you could just tell me this one thing that may be evident to you, but I can't see it in the data, I can give you a high quality decision. And this is where the technology is all about outpacing humans, not just in terms of speed, which is easy because it's technology, but in terms of the quality of those decisions. And this particular case, more transactions get unblocked quicker, happier customers, less calls into customer service. And this particular use case on its own, and again, it's just one of a number of use cases, but on its own would justify the investment in well under 12 months, making very significant savings as well as delivering a higher quality outcome. We've got some case studies on our website. I know there's some joint collateral that Rainbird and Blue Prism have created talking about intelligent fraud detection working together, which I'm sure the folks can get access to maybe from a link on both of our websites.
Absolutely. As we edge out of the pandemic, do you expect fraud to decrease, or is this trend here to stay?
That is a good question. There have been recorded instances of fraud going back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So I think all of us know instinctively that the threat of fraud is not going to go away any more than the threat of new viruses, possible future pandemics will. We know also that fraud has steadily been rising for many years before the pandemic. And when you add to that the increasing financial vulnerability, 27 million UK adults are now categorized as having low financial resilience, according to the FCA's latest survey. That figure's up 15% on their previous survey in February last year. It certainly doesn't seem like the trend is going to go in any other different direction. But I think there are some reasons to be optimistic. So for instance, when it came to stopping authorized fraud, the total loss to fraudsters actually fell by 5% in the last year. Mm-hmm. Technology is moving the needle here, actually. So implementing technology prevented £1.6 billion worth of losses last year. So there have been some big improvements in areas because banks are beginning to take these big strides in investing in technologies like ours. But fraud itself, I don't think that's going anywhere. And I think another comment I would just make here is the very large incumbent organizations are facing competition from neobanks, which offer customers a much more integrated and accessible digital experience. I don't think there's ever been more pressure on retail banks and credit card companies to ensure that they can match the nimbleness of these smaller organizations. They don't have the luxury of being able to design their entire operations to be digital first. But that's essentially what neobanks are. But they do need to boost efficiency and outcomes without compromising their ability to tackle this growing wave of financial crime. I think fraud is going to continue to increase, but there are some green shoots and signs that some of these larger organizations are beginning to get on top of it to a little bit, to some extent, by adopting these technologies.
So James, what do you expect fraud investigation to look like in the near future?
I think there's a very simple algorithm which describes how technology really has a role to play here, and that is that we need to take predictions. We need to be looking at our historic data to identify those glitches in the matrix, those patterns that might be a warning sign, but we have to apply that with seamless judgment before we can make a decision that has a high degree of efficacy, and that means that end-to-end process has to be auditable. So I think fraud investigation in the future is still very human-centric. I think we're not going to take humans out of the loop, but what we are going to do, particularly with these technologies becoming more and more democratized, is see fraud investigators being central to the process of building tools that enable them to see many magnitudes improvement in terms of the speed of what they're doing, but also very significant improvements in terms of the quality, and be able to handle this increasing pressure that there is from fraudsters that's really not going to go anywhere. So I think the fraud investigation of the future is a seamless end-to-end piece where it really combines the best of what humans and technology can do together in a transparent and auditable way that keeps the regulator happy.
Excellent. Well, James, really appreciate your time and your input today. This is such an important topic. It's very pertinent to the times we are living in. Really excited to have you as a partner of Blue Prism, and I wish you the best.
Thanks very much for inviting me on, Brett.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.